Come on guys, today we are going to learn Kubernetes services. Before starting with the hands-on, why do we need services actually? In the previous session, we deployed application using deployments, then we scaled them, then we perform the rolling updates. Everything is fine, but there is a one big issue. How do these pods communicate with each other? Or how do we communicate to the pods from the outside world? For that, we need Kubernetes services. Even each pods will have its own IP addresses. But pods are ephemeral, means pods can be created or destroyed at any time. So each time when a pod is restarted, it gets a new IP address. So this will make hard for other pods or for the external users to communicate with the pods. So Kubernetes services will provide a stable IP or DNS names. This will expose the application and it will ensure the seamless communication. So let's see that in action now. So I have already created the cluster. Let me create a deployment now. So I have already have the deployment YAML file that is I have used in previous sessions. I've explained this YAML file in previous session and go and check out those videos. So let's create this deployment now. For that, I can run kubectl apply -f, then the file name that is deployment.yaml. Let's enter that now. So deployment is created now. Now if I run kubectl get pods. So here 4 pods are created, but I don't have the IP address of these particular pods now. To get the IP address of the pods, I can just run the same command kubectl get pods. Then I can give a flag called as -o, then void. So here you can see the IP address of each pods now. Now for example, for first pod, the IP address is 192.168.82.67. Now if I delete this particular pod, so command will be kubectl delete pod, then the pod name, that is, if I run this now, now the pod is deleted, but to match the desired state, that is 4 replicas, my deployment will create a new pod now. Let's check the IP address of that particular new pod. The old pod IP is 192.168.82.67. Now if I run again the same command now a new pod is created 65 seconds ago and the IP address of that particular pod is different. So it has a different IP now. So this is why we need services to provide a consistent way to access these particular applications. So there are 4 types of Kubernetes services. The first one is ClusterIP. So here ClusterIP exposes a service inside the cluster. So ClusterIP can be used for internal communication. And the default service type is also ClusterIP one. And the second one is NodePort. This will expose the services externally using static port on each node. The third one is LoadBalancer type. This will use as a cloud provides a load balancer for external access. The fourth one is external name. Here we will map an Kubernetes service to an external domain name. So now let's check out ClusterIP first. So here I have already created a deployment, that is Nginx deployment. Let's export this deployment using the ClusterIP now. For that, I can run kubectl expose deployment and the deployment name, that is Nginx -deployment. Then -port. Port I will use 80 and the target port also. Target port also I will mention as 80 only. The type of the service, that is cluster IP. Cluster IP. So there's a typo here. Instead of L like a semicolon. Now you can see service Nginx deployment is exposed. And if I run kubectl get services, you can see Nginx deployment service is there and the type is cluster IP. And this service has stable cluster IP now. So this is the cluster IP service. So we can't access this in externally, but any pod inside the cluster can access this particular service using the cluster IP colon 80 port. Now I will just create a temporary pod in this particular cluster. Then from this particular temporary pod, I will check whether my service is accessible or not. So this is just a temporary pod called as curl pod. I will use this pod to run the curl command. Pod name is curl pod and the image is busybox plus curl image. Then I will run in interactive mode and this is that for terminal. I got some error like bin sh is not one b, and this is because I am running in Windows, not in Linux. But the curl pod is created now. So in Windows, we can just run winpty, then the kubectl exec command. Now I have logged into the curl pod now. Now if I run curl, then http and the cluster IP, that is this is the cluster IP and colon 80. I'm getting the Nginx default response. This means I am able to access the Nginx pod from this particular curl pod. So pods inside cluster can be communicate with each other using the cluster IP. That is about the cluster IP. Let's check the NodePort service now. Let's create a NodePort service now using the command kubectl expose deployment. The deployment, that is Nginx deployment name. Then the port, that is 80, and the target port, that is also 80. Then the service type, that is NodePort. I got an error like Nginx deployment is already because cluster IP services already exist. Either I can delete that cluster IP service or I can just give a new name for this particular service hyphen name equal to Nginx hyphen I will give np means NodePort. Then enter this command. Now you can see in service Nginx np is exposed. Let's run kubectl get services now. I have one more service called as Nginx NP now, and is the type is a node port, and I have node port that is 31,722 is the node port of this particular service. Now I should be able to access this particular Nginx application using this particular node port, but I have to know the external IP of this particular nodes also. To get the external IP of nodes, I can just run the command kubectl get nodes -mo wide. Now here I can see this is the external IP of first node and this is the external IP of the second node. Now let's access this external IP with this particular node port IP in my browser. Let's see whether Nginx will come up or not. So external IP colon the node port. The page is still loading. I got site can't be reached error. This might be because 31,722 port is not open in my AWS security group. I have added the security group inbound rule here 31,722 port and for the anywhere. This is not the best practice. For testing, I have added this particular CADA range now. Let's save this rule. Now let's try the external IP and the port name that is 31,722. Now I am able to access this particular Nginx page. So when we export the Kubernetes deployment using the NodePort service, I can access my application using the external IP of the node with the 31,722 that is the node port. I have one more node here. Let's see I am able to access the application using this external IP also. Let's check that now. Yes, I'm able to access the Nginx application using my second node external IP also. So that is about the NodePort service. Let's check the load balancer service. So let's create a load balancer service now. For that, I can run the command kubectl expose deployment. The deployment name that is Nginx deployment and the port port that will be 80 and the target port that is also 80. Then the type type. That type will be load balancer. I got a same error like Nginx deployment is already exist, so I will give a new name now name equal to Nginx LB. LB means load balancer service. So now service Nginx LB is exposed. Now if I run the command kubectl get service, one more service Nginx LB is created and the type is load balancer. And I will get the external IP now. External IP will be this DNS name now. I can use this particular host name to access my load balancer service. So to create this load balancer host name, it might take a couple of minutes. Then you can access this particular host name in your browser. Host name and the port will be 80. You can see welcome to Nginx page now. So when I create a load balancer service in my Kubernetes cluster, it will create a load balancer in AWS. For example, if I go to load balancer service here, you can see there is one load balancer is created and this is the same load balancer. I have used AWS here, but this is similar in Azure or GCP also. That is about the load balancer service type. I am not able to demonstrate the external name service type, but in external name, you will map your services with the external domain name. And one more thing, every service in Kubernetes will get a DNS name by default. Instead of using IP, we can use that particular DNS name also. Now, if I run NS lookup for the Nginx deployment service in the curl pod, I will get the default DNS names here. Similarly, I can do the NS lookup for any other services also like Nginx LB. So it also its own DNS here. Similarly for my NodePort service also. So here you can see the DNS name here. So that's it for today. Today we learned about the importance of Kubernetes services. Then we deep dived into the 4 types of Kubernetes services. Subscribe and check out other videos too and keep learning.